Hello, and welcome back to Shatter Our Souls with Novaria. And today is the last Metroid video of 2024. I'm a little bit nostalgic about this, as this section of the channel as a whole has done exceptionally well overall compared to virtually every other section of this channel. And I have you, viewers, to thank for it. So, today's goal is going to be aiming to get at least one of the keys to the battle against Quadraxis, and most likely also getting the screw attack while I'm at it. I just have to remember whereabouts I'm heading to make that happen. Oh, right, the main research lab. Okay, so with all that in mind, last time we took a look into, or a deeper look at what it is that Dark Samus as a character represents, is, and shows off throughout the game. And honestly, there's not a whole lot else I can talk about at the moment in time. Unfortunately, while this was the glory days, the heyday of Nintendo and storytelling as a whole, it kind of falls a little bit short, in my opinion. Now, this is to say, in part, if we compare Prime 1 and 2 against one another, Prime 1 has the bulk of its story told through the lore entries, the logs that come throughout the game that kind of fill in the pieces as to what happened on Talon 4. And while it's disingenuous to be able or to point finger and say, oh yeah, Metroid Prime 2 doesn't do as well storytelling wise as Prime 1, Prime 2 also has very big shoes to fill. In that regard, Prime 2 Echoes does something that I don't see very many games doing today, which is that a lot of its basic information that we get is all environmental storytelling, but it's also told in a very similar light to how Dark Souls tells its story, where item descriptions and character dossiers come the into the equation and really show off what the developers were thinking when they made the games. Now, I admit, I am not somebody who spends hours scanning every little piece of lore. I am probably missing so much information, and I'll be among the first to admit it. I don't believe that I know everything there is to know about these games. What I have instead is a wide-reaching general knowledge that seeks to showcase, I guess, a little bit of how far we've come in the creation of these games as a whole. Ah, power bombs has not served me well this time, and I am almost out of ammunition. This is not a good thing. So, today's, I suppose, main threat, I believe, is going to be in that tube there. The enemy in that tube is well, it's just a machine, but the machine itself inside that tube is blocking off a large section of the map. And with it blocking off this large section of this area, there's really not much that can be done while waiting for it. So that's going to have to be taken down. Now, one thing that I suppose comes up a lot when talking about the Metroid franchise and what Samus's capabilities are, one of the earliest statements that crops up on a regular basis is that Samus has the screw attack. The screw attack in the 2D games is treated as a press A to win button. And I don't believe that this is accurate to what the screw attack actually is or actually does. I've always looked at the screw attack as a traversal option that Samus can now get from A to B pretty much anywhere in the world, where she can pass unjudged or unhindered by land masses or massive gaps within the terrain as a whole. But there was a video on YouTube that I watched, which was how effectively looked at how far Samus could get into Doom Eternal. And first and foremost, I actually agree with basically everything this individual says about Samus. And partially because it's taking the individual took the time to compare and contrast Samus to the Doom guy, and every action that they proposed that Samus would make sense within the confines of the lore of both worlds. But the first major statement was that Samus is effectively this nigh unstoppable force, and that she doesn't really use all of her abilities to the extent that a lot of players think that she should. By the way, for a source, you can look up Nathan out. I'll leave a I will leave the name in the description of the video so that you can take a look, see if you are so inclined at a later time. But the individual, Nathan, spent the video comparing Doomguy to Samus, but went much deeper than just surface level, and even admitted that, well, a lot of people would look at the screw attack and say, oh yeah, just use the screw attack, boom, done. He didn't want that. Instead, he took the time to break down every individual ability that Samus has had both in the 2D and 3D games to showcase just how strong Samus actually was within the confines of this franchise and against other franchises. I'm of the mindset that if Samus were to end up in a circumstance where she'd be thrown into the circumstances that another character might end up in, that 9 times out of 10, Samus would make it through. A good example of that, if you look on my channel, there is a walkthrough slash a full game look through of a game called Prey. Prey was built by Bethesda in 2016, and it's effectively what would happen if shapeshifters, similar to the King, were to make it aboard a space station just above Earth. How likely would we be to survive? It's an immersive sim, and it has a lot going for it in that regard. But the thing is that Morgan Yu, the main protagonist, or your playable character, has abilities that Samus couldn't dream of, but also is very hindered by his lack of capabilities, so to speak. So, looking at the character in that light, Samus is incredibly well-rounded. And while Samus is not the type of shoot first, ask questions later type of character, I do believe that in a circumstance similar to Bethesda's Prey from 2016, there's really not much of an argument to be made that Samus wouldn't be able to survive. Or at least wouldn't make the decisions necessary to get from A to B. Now, there are a couple things that I question whether or not Samus would do. An example being a litmus test, so to speak. You are stuck in a situation where there is a shuttle on its way to Earth, and there was a 20-minute window between when the shuttle left the space station and it arriving on Earth. And the question became, within this 20-minute window, the Typhon, the shapeshifters, had broken out or had been discovered. And the individual who was the captain of this space station, this ship, so to speak, had to question whether or not to abort the mission for the sake of saving all of humanity, or to leave it be as it was, on the hope that the Typhon were not aboard the ship that was sent down to Earth. That's really the whole spiel behind it. If Samus were in that situation, I don't really know what Samus would do. It's one of those if-then statements that kind of feels a little bit murky. It's muddy water. It's something that very few characters would be willing to do. And I want to make this very clear. I don't believe that it would be an easy decision for Samus to make. But I do believe that if Samus was caught between a rock and a hard place, where she had to sacrifice a planet for the betterment of the entire universe, that Samus would. So I don't believe that I believe in that circumstance, Samus would self-destruct the ship that potentially has shapeshifters aboard it, simply because that 20-minute window is a little bit tight to make a guesstimation on. But there are other smaller details that come up in multiple games that I believe that Samus as a character would approach from different points of view. I believe that by and large, Samus as a character tends to focus on the path of greatest good. And it's hard to describe what greatest good actually is or what that means. It's all up for interpretation depending on who it is that's saying it. But I believe that Samus makes decisions, for the most part, based on what she believes will have the greatest positive impact in the universe. If Ravenbeak was not trying to create an entire army of ex-parasite Chozo warriors, Samus might not have fought him. It was one of those, there are numerous circumstances where Samus comes up as a character and a villain seems to have an okay stance, but due to execution, she tends to fight against it. And that's something that comes up often in video games, is that approach is one of the biggest and hardest problems that come up in video games. Because if a character has the right idea but the wrong approach, we simply just call them a broken hero. And while they weren't exactly meant to have the good fortune that they did, and so on and so forth. It's a little bit backwards compared to what a lot of people would assume. What is going on? Oh, jeez. It's just a singular piece of machinery. The Echo Visor is one of those weird items that works differently depending on location. Up until you get the Annihilator Beam, it tends to be one of those items that works fine for most things. Left, middle, right? Yes, cool. The Echo Visor works well for most circumstances. But the moment that you get the Annihilator Beam, is the moment that any puzzles involving the Echo Visor are no longer viable to do with a simple charged attack and need to be done using the Annihilator Beam in general. It's not the end of the world, but it is something of note. Why do I feel a sudden sense of foreboding? I feel as though I remember one of the keys being in the Dark World version of this room. I'm not sure how to get to it, though. Unfortunately, my memory of the Sanctuary Fortress is lacking at this moment in time. What I can say is that these Raybit guys are going to be a huge problem, because if they didn't shut down Samus's suit in and of itself, that wouldn't be that big of an issue. But the reality is that because they shut down Samus's suit at its core, it's a problem and leads to a lot of circumstances that could easily be avoided. Now, I admit, I want to take a look at Quadraxis for a moment. Quadraxis is probably when I when I was making the plans to start this series, I was talking to a couple of my close friends about what I thought would be the easiest and the hardest portions of this entire trilogy. And I mentioned that Prime 1 was going to be the easiest. It had the most simplistic of the base design, so to speak, compared to the rest of the trilogy. Prime 2 had more ambiguous design at times, but also had a lot more circumstances that, because of the light of eighth or the light and dark world duality, their bosses had a tendency to keep the player stuck in a single location. And hyper mode in Prime 3 was kind of shoehorned in, but they made it so that the hyper mode was a necessary part of playing the game, even on normal mode. And to my understanding of Prime 3's hyper mode version, is more like a how do I put it? It's a bit more of a balancing act. Prime 1 had, for the most part, it felt like enemies just had a little bit more health and dealt a little bit more damage, but overall, most of the time, everything worked out pretty well for me. Prime 2, I always had this lingering fear that whatever I did, if it wasn't done just right, I was going to end up in a huge world of hurt. And I looked at a couple of bosses with that in mind. The first was Amorbus. Amorbus, it was one of those bosses that, if it works well, it worked well, but rarely did it work the way that I intended. Nope, not back there. Um, because Amorbus was a bit of quite a big damage sponge even on normal mode, and its entire identity was around dealing damage to it 6 times, I figured that Amorbus would be functional. Maybe not easy, but easy enough to get by. I figured that the Torvus Bog enemies, notably the Speed Boost Guardian, was going to be a bit of a problem, because the Speed Boost Guardian was designed around normal mode or even veteran, but you make it more of a damage sponge on top of its already very impressive stats, and throwing its balancing out the window, it kind of was a bit of a guessing game as to how it would work. The thing is that most of the bosses in Prime 2 had this basic mentality of being reasonable overall to take down by using healing springs. Admittedly, somewhat liberally, but it was always an option to, if you were good enough at dodging, you could heal mid-battle fairly easily. Where am I? Oh, the door I need to go is right through is right behind me. Well, ain't that just something? Quadraxis doesn't have that option. And comparing Quadraxis to anything in Prime, Quadraxis has one battle that comes even remotely close as far as the difficulty as well as the phases of the battle go. And that one battle is against, well, I suppose two. You can look at the battle against Meta Ridley being the equivalency, or you could look at the battle against the Metroid Prime itself. If my memory serves, Quadraxis is a 3-part battle. And so, if that's the case, each of those 3 phases would equate to the, I suppose, getting to the Metroid Prime, or the Impact Crater, being part 1. The main battle with the Metroid Prime itself being part 2. And then the third part being the battle against the core, wherein the battle is mostly over already. It's just a matter of how much can you take and how likely are you to be able to beat it with resources you have left. And so, with that in mind, I believe that Quadraxis is going to be the battle that makes or breaks this entire run. By the time I reach Emperor Ing, the final battle against Dark Samus, most challenge is already out the window. And there are some things I can do to cheese a battle against the Emperor Ing, like, I don't know, using a power bomb every now and again. I can gear up to absolute ridiculous levels to try to prevent any further issues cropping up during sections of the battle. But Quadraxis, there's only so much I can do at the moment to prepare for it. I can go back and collect a few more missile tanks. I can collect a couple more power bombs. But when you're in an arena where you are constantly losing health simply by existing, you're walking into a very rough circumstance, to say the least. And I'm falling. So, that's my thought on it. But, what do I know? Maybe Quadraxis is going to be one of those battles that goes absolutely fantastic despite my expectations, because sometimes that happens when you're playing video games. It's one of those things where you think that the challenge is over because you beat the boss, and suddenly you're tackling some side enemy that had no relevance to the battle you were dealing with, and that's what takes you out. So, who knows, right? But let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. Do you think Quadraxis is going to be the main challenge of the video, or of the series? Or do you believe that there's going to be some unforeseen circumstances that crop up as a direct result of how everything goes up to that point? You know, I'm getting really, really sick of these things. Alright. Time for the super missiles. I should have just started with that. But that's the nice thing about hindsight. It's always 2020. Anywho. I, bel I believe it's the screw attack that's in there. So once we have the screw attack, it's more or less going to be shutting down for the night. Maybe, I think, getting that one missing, and getting that one missing key I had mentioned prior. Uh-uh. Stop it. So, there have been rumors that I've come across. Whether or not they're real or not, I don't know. But with the success of the Super Mario movie, as well as Secret Levels video game in um, Secret Level on Amazon Prime that has its how do I put it? It's been taking a lot of care in creating shorts that really show off what the characters of the games that they were characters of the games and franchises that they originated from with a lot of care. And nowhere is this, I think, more apparent than the Mega Man uh, mini section. It's only like a 3-minute video, and 95% of it can be found on YouTube already in one of 3 segments. But the fact of the matter is that after the success of the Super Mario movie, I believe that video game movies are becoming a more common um, occurrence. And the reason I believe that it's going to become a consistent and more common occurrence is because they figured out the formula of how to make a good video game movie. Now, let me be clear, some still flop. But the movies around video games from 10 years ago compared to now are very much a totally different ballpark. I believe that with the Metroid franchise being as open-minded as it is, as sparse with certain details as it has been, provided that they take the time necessary to do the series justice, and this is the most important part, it cannot be made for a cash grab. If they take the time to do the series justice, I believe that Metroid could have a phenomenal video game based movie. But, or TV show, animation, whatever it ends up being. But they have to do it in a way that preserves Samus as a character without retelling the story of the character as a whole verbatim. Now, what I mean by this is if you took Metroid Zero Mission, Metroid Prime 1 or 2, and tried to segment them into a singular movie, it could not be a one-to-one retelling. And that's kind of the first major pitfall that video game movies fall into, is that they like the mentality of a retelling, not a new story. A new story is a little bit disingenuous to what I believe would work. It has to tell a story of something that we want to see. Whether it's Samus's time in the Federation as a prequel, actually taking the time to talk about the Federation days, or how Samus first donned the suit to begin with back on planet Zebes with the Chozo as a whole. These are 2 circumstances that, if done correctly, a video game movie would have a lot to work with. But I'm going to say this with a little bit of a personal bias. I don't see Samus working in this type of or in that type of environment either. I know I'm saying 2 totally different things, to be clear. Um, I'm saying that Samus has a better luck now than she did 10 years ago of having a video game based or a movie based on Metroid than we did 10 years ago because they've figured out how to make it work. But Samus as a character is very hard to pin down. And that's not to say that we don't know anything about the character. It is simply that we know enough about the character that trying to put a voice behind it, and trying to speak it out has gone poorly in the past. And I believe that if we were to attempt to do a Metroid movie, that they would need to be very careful with how they presented the information. That's what I'm going to stick with. Because if we have a retelling of the unholy Metroid game from 2010, that is not going to fly and is going to flop harder than any other video game movie on the planet. Anywho, I have rambled on long enough. Why am I heading back over here? So, the key I'm looking for is right by that door on the left. But I'm having a little bit of a memory lapse of how to get to it. So I'm just taking a little bit of a scouting outing, shall we say, just to double check the maps and whatnot. Make sure that I actually understand what I'm getting myself into before charging in and throwing my head against a wall, because I have a really good habit of doing that. And while I do enjoy the odd brick wall, normally it's with a slightly different lens or a slightly different approach to it. Okay, so I'm just gonna head back to the light world, I think. What am I doing? Head to the light world. And then jump down the shaft, and then find a way to jump back up the shaft. That's why I needed the screw attack in the first place. Get the key, and we'll be shutting her down for the day. Anywho, with all of that in mind, do you think a Metroid movie would work? Do you think that it would be approached from a similar vein to Prime? Would it be a retelling of an earlier portion of, or maybe it would be like a retelling of Zero Mission? Or would it be something more akin to the quote-unquote glory days of Metroid, where Samus is effectively telling the stories of her earliest missions and how she became the hunter that she is? Let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your individual points of view, because I'm a little bit closed-minded sometimes. And to the Dark World? Nice thing about being back here now is all the challenges for the Dark World in here are already completed. So it's just a matter of climbing up the yellow brick road. I slid a little bit too much for that. I'm a little out of practice with using the screw attack, which honestly I'm not too upset with. I'd be a little concerned if it came back to me a little too naturally. And it's one of those abilities that throughout the franchise has been one of the harder ones to pin down, on average. Anywho, we're just gonna head back to the light world, do a quick save, and then next time we will be taking on Quadraxis. I gotta say, I'm excited. I didn't think that I would be this far into the franchise at this point in time. And if I'm honest, I'm a little bit concerned about running out of content for Prime 3 prior to the release of Prime 4, as we still don't have a date. But that's a problem for future me to figure out, I guess. Anywho, if you like what you see, or are interested in seeing the end of Prime 2, drop a like, leave subscribe, and we will catch you next time. Until then, I hope you have a good one. No, we're turning around. Sometimes I do get myself turned around in this maze. It's not often, but it does in fact happen. Anywho, bye for now.